please join me in welcoming Antony Gormley to speak to us tonight.
Thank you very much, Francis. I'm not going to use the mic. I'm going to show you a few slides. But first, I just wanted to say something about being here. I'm happy to be talking again here at the National Gallery of Victoria. I'm happy that the 6 prototypes for Inside Australia are here. It's become increasingly important to me that the work asks questions about who art can be for, where it can be found, who can be represented in it. And I think that project Inside Australia, that I'll show you some slides of as part of the slide presentation, was a very important benchmark in asking those very questions. Yesterday it was announced in the press and in the media that I've been shortlisted for the 4th Plinth. And I see that as a continuation of the questions asked by Inside Australia. And my proposal is that the plinth should be occupied by living people, continually occupied. 8,670 living people standing on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square for 1 hour each, 24 hours a day, in rain and shine, in night and day. And this is another, in a way, experiment to see. Can you all hear me? To see how, in a way, life occupying the position of art might form a new way of presenting and representing the human state of our time. Inside Australia was another way of doing the same thing, inscribed in geological time as opposed to living time. But anyway, I would just like to go through about 80 slides that basically follow. I think of the work as entirely experimental. I think that every single project, in a way, tries to argue, again, for its validity, for its own right to exist. I'm not sure that the work depends on, in a sense, a strategic position within art history. I was lucky enough to study art history. I hope that I've left that behind. I think that issues about use value for art are more important to me than exchange value. And I think that art has to, in some way, help us understand both the built environment, in other words, the world that we have made out of an inherited earth, and indeed the earth itself, the natural environment, you might say, the self-regulating systems of nature. Anyway, at a certain point, I went through art school like everybody does, and at a certain point, on arriving at postgraduate, I realized how hyperbolic and, in a sense, romantic my attitude was to the work. How, in a sense, it was linked to imagistic concerns. And I show you this slide first because I think it's the key to, in a way, understanding my experimental approach. You could say this is a form of cubism. This is called Breadline. It's simply a loaf of processed white factory-made bread, laid out in the way that we experience it physically, a bite at a time. It's a drawing, you might say. but it's both the object, it's a real loaf of bread, but also a representation of the object, a repositioning of its material substance in a way that I think both makes logical but also imagistic sense. You have to walk along it in order to appreciate it, and in doing that, in some way, that physical response to this object that has been turned into a line, and therefore has been turned in some sense into a temporal sequence, begins to reveal itself. So that idea of not trying to be imagistic, not trying to be representational, not trying to be expressive, but simply looking at the, in a way, experiential structure of objects became very important to me. And this is another work from the same time. It's called Full Bowl, and it's simply a bowl that sits in the hand. It's about 7.5 inches in diameter. And every bowl is the mother of the bowl inside it. They were beaten one inside the other. I started with a wooden former that I carved out of, just on a lathe. And I think what I was trying to do here was describe, in a way, the function of a bowl with bowls, but at the same time, think about the beginnings and ends of things, think about the contexts and contents, think about, in a way, the mutual dependability of two voids, a central void. I think it's very important that the void at the core of this full bowl is empty. But obviously also is the space that contains the bowl is empty. And what this object begins to describe is a resonance between those two spaces, the contextual space and the containing or contained space. And I think at the same time there's a sense in which there is a description about wave function, about resonance, about a testing of edges where things begin and end that I think continues in different ways throughout the work. I wanted to show this work, which may not be very well known to you. It's called Rearranged Desert, and it was Vicken and I, Vicken, who's here tonight, sitting in the second back row, who's my wife, also an artist. We both got Boyce travelling scholarships in 1979, and I very much wanted to go to the Western Desert and see the work of Michael Heiser and Walter de Maria. And this is very close to where Walter de Maria made his mile-long double chalk drawing. And it was, in some senses, a return to the site where American art attempted to find a new authenticity outside the market that people like Richard Long within England had been using as a place of inscription for highly formalized, like Walter de Maria's mile-long parallel chalk drawing, for, in a way, abstraction in relation to nature. This work was simply the result of me throwing a hand-sized stone as far as I could and using that as a radius and clearing all the stones within that space. And that's what you can see here. You can see a cairn in the middle surrounded by a clear area. This is a dry lake bed in not far from Flagstaff. Having done that, this is a digital anomaly, the fact that I've lost my legs, but you'll just have to forget that for a moment. having made that cairn, I then threw all of the stones out. Obviously the stones that I'd gathered were not all hand-sized, they were a variety of size. I then threw the stones out again, and here is the finished work. You might say, so what? It's not very different from when you started. I've always been very fond of Beckett. But I think this is, well, it's obvious. I mean, the relationship between this and full bowl is clear. I think it's a great thing that you can't see the work. I think that what the work is a kind of residue of a human event that has imperceptibly changed the distribution of matter in this space. I don't think anybody will have ever seen it in location. But in some senses this was another experiment, like full bowl, that still exists, and like Breadline, that doesn't. Coming back and thinking about space, again, in terms of intimacy, in terms of survival, in terms of the distinction between, in a way, subjective internal space and space at large, I started thinking about clothes as a second skin. It's the full bowl thing again. And this is simply a set of my clothes left in the same relation one to the other as they are on the body, but expanded to room size. On the floor you can see they were a good pair of shoes before I cut them up. The 5 layers of leather, they were Church Brothers shoes, good shoes. Then you basically, this is what ends up as shoe ribbon. It's a continuous strip. It's like unpeeling an orange, but the orange has several layers. So the shoe, the sock, and the trouser at a certain point overlap, and the shirt, and the undershirt, and the jacket, and the pullover make a certain density higher up. It makes an enclosure. This was in a room 14 foot by 28, and it simply cut off half of the room. You couldn't go into it. So here was, as it were, the description of a space that had once enclosed a human being, that was now presented as an unenterable arena, with these traces of, if you like, potential positions on the floor. This is the sort of end of the bread experiment. This is bed, 600 loaves of a processed mother's pride. Mother's pride is the name, the trade name. I think it's slightly ironic, because certainly this bread has made the furthest journey from the field possible, and I don't think there was any mothers involved. It's really horrible stuff, and it took 3.5 months to make this work. I'm never going to eat processed white bread again. And effectively this is my volume, and this is the first work in which the presence of the body is as it were, indexically intimated. I don't think of this as a representation. The form was simply derived from a silhouette drawing made by Vicken of me lying on the floor, and then that was translated into a contour map. And I made a very clear program of eating up to 20 slices a day, and this is the result. So how do we begin to think about the body less as an object, more as a place of transformation? In other words, a kind of place where matter turns into mind through the process of eating, a place where, in a way, vitality, a certain form of energy, resides for a while, without going into mimesis and representation and narrative. So this work, it was one of the first of the body cases, and I call them body cases because that's exactly what they are. These are molds taken from my body that have then been covered in lead to make them totally hermetic. This is still the time of the Cold War. This is still a time in which, in some senses, I was convinced that the end of this planet was going to be created by human agency, and that it was going to be nuclear. And the idea that somehow this space that had been removed from life, but in some way was generated from it, could be saved as a memory. It's called Still Feeling Corner. And I think the title's important. The titles are always important in the work. The title is an attempt to indicate that, in a way, this is not a picture of something. It's a place that comes out of a process of being that invites empathetic projection. And it acknowledges its redundancy, its dormancy, its vacuity. I think that my work is contentless. It's simply an empty space where a man once was that doesn't have a place in the world. It's a redundant and, to some sense, abject work, but it calls upon us in a certain way. I think that calling is very, very important. So the lack that the work has, certainly in terms of the whole history of, in a way, Western sculpture, which became obsessed, in a way, post-Renaissance, and certainly in the Baroque, with the notion of movement and finding the right moment in a sequence of movement for the narrative to be encapsulated. This is something very different. And I think the work works as a form of trap. I mean, it is a, what's the right word? An affect trap. So here's a real evidence of entrapment. This is called sense. This is, in a way, the condition of architecture, the condition that, in a way, the civilized, urban, human body lives in, but reduced to the minimum. This is a block about just under 3 foot square, in which space has been replaced by mass and body mass by space, and it's simply me crouching in the most compressed position I could manage. And the indexical impression of the body left there very precisely for the first time. I realized the failure of the lead works. In a sense, the lead works pertained to the condition of statue but didn't fulfill it. In many senses, people were right to think of them as gloomy, dull, and, well, functionless. I think with this work, there's a sense in which the intimate space registered within the block is in continuity with its context. And that call on the affect, the empathic inhabitation by the viewer, I think is much more readily accessed. So I just thought I'd show you, daily life in the studio. This is at a certain point I abandoned the making of the body cases and decided that there were several reasons for this, and decided that I should try to evoke, in a way, a moment of being in mass. And this is a work in progress called Critical Mass. So this is me standing in the studio waiting for the casting to begin for the next in this sequence, the work was still, I think, analytic and experimental in terms of trying to find syntax, trying to unearth a form of syntax within bodily positions. And basically there are 12 body forms from the most minimal crouching to the most vertical standing. And that's what I'm just about to make. I use cling film simply as the separator. The process takes an hour or two. The plaster is applied by assistants. It's the absolute reverse of the classical position of the sculptor making an idealized figure at arm's length. This is an internal condition that's being, as it were, registered by this plaster. It demands a certain degree of concentration. It demands also a certain degree of complicity. You have to have complete trust in who is working with you. The hand on the right belongs to Vic and the hand on the left to Jonathan Lakin Hall. This is the moment of release, having been cut out. And the resulting mold is then used to make the massive body form. And this is now taking that mold and having used it to make an impression in sand. This is the mold now just prior to being cast. This is the casting, so they weigh about 700 kilos each, 3/4 of a ton. And this is the moment of breaking out. This is another in the series of 12, a seated body form. And this is how they were displayed. I think of this as a meditation really on the 20th century. It's, a century of genocide, of war, and this was made in Vienna, where it was impossible, I think, to have a building with tram lines and not think of the way in which the iron railroad had been part of the final solution. Within that railroad, I cut 14 pits, a conscious kind of reference to the Stations of the Cross, but without any religious, in a way, connotation. At both ends of the building that is 200 meters long, 35 meters wide, we have two vertical standing forms that act as a kind of witness. So this is looking the other way. There are two works that are the right way up. I mean, other than those two witnesses, one in this kneeling position, I think it's very important that it is, in a way, the position of supplication rather than the position of prayer. And this kind of traditional Shinto meditation position. And then several others that are like still feeling in this, in a way, position of acknowledging their own object nature. They are things. The majority were just dumped out of the back of the lorry and left on the floor. What does this mean and how does it work? The meaning, I don't think this is, you could say, displaced material in human form, and it's very much up to the viewer I have said that this is a kind of anti-monument to, in a way, atrocity. in a way that's already over prescriptive. I think there is a sense of an uncertainty about the position of the body and what our attitude to it is. Certainly, perhaps a lament for the loss of, in a way, the high and noble aims of, say, the Renaissance in its attitude to the human body. But nevertheless, the abjectness that might have hovered around Still Feeling Corner, I think is replaced by something, there is still potential. And what I like about this is that even though so few of the bodies are the right way up, as it were, they are not self-determining, they are, as it were, in full, there is still a sense of potency.